Hey everyone, and welcome to this session, one of the final wrap-up sessions here in the Automation Summit. And my session today is really going to focus on managing your automation journey at scale with something called Automation Hub. This is something at Ahead we've developed over a number of years with clients, whether they're doing automation on-premises in the public cloud, and helping people sort of tie everything together. So with that said, let's jump straight into the presentation here. For the agenda, first of all, we're going to focus on some of the observations that we see in the industry, like why do we need an automation hub? What are some of the personas? What are some of the patterns that we see? And then I'll show you what Automation Hub is. We'll talk about the architecture first of all, and then we'll get into a demonstration. Following that, outside of provision and just the overview, I'll also show you some of the day two operations that a number of our customers are starting to explore as well. And again, we'll get into a short demonstration there around IaaS patching as one of the common day two operations. So with that, let's jump into these observations and what we're ultimately seeing today. Well, the big issue is the problem most organizations are combating today is this issue of wait time that you can see in the middle there. Waiting time, perhaps it's email requests, perhaps we're passing ServiceNow tickets around. And first of all, before we even get into that wait time, there's a prioritization. Can I get somebody to help me with something? Perhaps a developer wants to write some code. They want to just get onboarded to the organization. And then we send all these requests around. Some of that we automate along the way. But ultimately, there's a time period before full environment gets delivered or before, say, access gets delivered. And this could be 20 to 40 days, of actually inflow of the user actually, working through the process there. With that, when we say waiting, this is what it really is. The consumer puts in this request. It feels like we're passing this piece of paper around. Often they don't have enough visibility into where that request is in the queue with the various teams. Perhaps this is a server request. It went off to the server team, networking, monitoring, backup security, back to the server team. Finally gets handed over to the consumer so they can deploy their app and begin testing and hopefully what was delivered was correct. And so there's a lot of chance of failure and having to resubmit and then get hold of people in the organization. The other observations just to think about also is that we still see a lot of these things, whether they're on premises or in the public cloud. Sprawl we've dealt with for years. It exasperated as we went into virtualization. On premises it took longer to rack and stack servers. Then as we went into virtualization and then public cloud, sprawl expanded. Lifecycle, do we keep track of our services that we've delivered? Handoff, inconsistency, no visibility, requests with incomplete data, and just no integration always with ITSM processes. Have they adapted, with the way the organization has moved on? And so we really want to start to solve these problems. The way we look at it is through three key areas now. When we're defining an automation strategy, it's one, who are the consumers of these capabilities? Where do consumers need to provision resources from and to? Those are our providers. And then what are the patterns that we want to expose, based on those providers that we have? What do we want to expose to the personas that are requesting them? Let's jump into the personas very quickly. Well, there's essentially two primary consumers that we see today. Not to say then, you can add additional circles and buckets, but if you sort of lump them together, there's sort of two frameworks that we have to ultimately account for. The traditional option is really where a user wants to go to a portal. Maybe they're not super advanced. Maybe they're not familiar with APIs, pipelines, all the new DevOps tools. They just want to get their VM or another asset provisioned or updated. Then you've got some of the modern architectures and processes around DevOps, APIs, a lot of users that are deploying into containers will want to use pipelines. They've adopted techniques such as infrastructure as code. They may want to consume from the APIs directly and write some of their own automation. They typically want to operate by initiating, commits to their code repositories as well. And so we've got to balance the needs. It doesn't help sometimes to say, hey, I just need to focus on DevOps and the new pipelines and tool in there when I've got users that just aren't coming along for the ride, and maybe the business doesn't need them to. So you ultimately need to decide, who are your personas, who are your customers, and how can we service them best. If we then look at the providers, there's obviously a big mix today. When we look at Automation Hub as the center here, it ultimately has to account for things like IoT and Edge now, which are new. We've got SaaS, which we've been adding for a long time, as well as just the differences between local data center services that you will provide and public services where it's not just virtual machines, but managed services, anything as a service, DR capabilities, and other things, that exist in the public cloud as well, beyond just virtual machines. What helps is to build a services library around this. Essentially, these are building blocks to achieve outcomes that are better, faster, and more consistent. So if you sort of look through the categories here, we've got administrative services. We need to account for compute, storage, networking, DR, backup, login, monitoring, config roles, day two operations. These are categories, and I think as you start to look at your organization and think about the requests you're getting, it helps to sort of look at all the pieces that go along. Maybe just look at a server build and think of all the systems you touch and the reasons why, and that will help you define those service capabilities, that ultimately you need to provide. This then in turn, we've looked at the providers, we looked at the personas, we've got this, inventory of service capabilities. How do we start to think about patterns that we want to produce now? And it helps to first begin by thinking about pattern consumption. How are we going to assemble these patterns? Well, first of all, let's look at our service providers. On the bottom here, we've got VMware, perhaps an on-prem data center, perhaps we've got public cloud providers in a couple of regions, and now we've got our cloud team or our automation team. However you arrange, don't worry too much about the naming of the team, but the group of people that ultimately are responsible for defining these patterns and helping you automate against them. And essentially here we'll take, bottom right, we'll have a service perhaps from one of the public cloud providers. We'll say, yep, we're going to onboard that. We're going to create our own service catalog. We're going to also onboard storage services from the cloud providers in this region, perhaps an S3 bucket, a blob store, etc. And perhaps we've got VMs that we want to provision on premises and provide that up as well. Again, keep adding these services. We say, yep, we want to add standards, procedures, put governance controls on top of them, and essentially build out our own services library. We've talked to the business. They've said this is what they need. We've got these capabilities now. So also the next time somebody comes to you, you can say, yep, we've already got standards and procedures around this storage service. We don't necessarily need to go and add another one. So you've built your own catalog internally of services that you provide up. Over time, then you'll decide, okay, what personas are going to consume those services. So if somebody's in the traditional model, perhaps you want to present a couple of services together that they can request via form and provision a whole stack. Perhaps they're requesting pipelines on demand. And then other users, perhaps you're requesting individual services and they're exposed via APIs. And so there's no right or wrong here. You will couple together the services that make sense. You'll expose groups as API, groups in the form, individual services in forms and APIs. That's all entirely up to you and is based on the business requirements and application teams, specifically in how they're going to consume those services. So when we think about stitching the services together, we've talked about the tech orchestrator. The tech orchestrator composes services together and publishes them for consumption. So blueprints created from services and environment decisions. Environment decisions are questions and business logic that you would ask your users up front. So perhaps you're trying to decide where you place that virtual machine. Which region does it go into? Which network does it go into? Because of perhaps security concerns if there's PII data on that machine as well. And so you'll take these services from the categories, group them together, and publish them in the catalog. And this is often your first blueprint, a very basic virtual machine blueprint that you create and publish out there. Over time, you'll need new capabilities, right? So those categories we talked about earlier on, you're going to add services to them. All capabilities will go through some process. We use the terms standardize, procedurize, and automate. Define the service, agree with the business, what the standards are, agree with security, how you're going to secure and govern that process. Define the procedures for how you would manually provision the service. You've got the standards now. Now, how would I manually deploy it? Maybe write scripts out, at that time as well. And then you would go into automation, whether that's actually the scripts to automate or whether it's infrastructure as code tools like Terraform and others that we'll get into. Services then are considered production ready and added to the catalog for consumption. And one important thing is to consider using tag-based automation wherever possible. Often, we see customers create more automation, perhaps for patching and other monitoring services, and they start creating REST API calls all over the place. Instead, perhaps you just tag the service, and then those third-party tools can read off the tag and put services in the right operational, settings that they need. With that, when we look into one of those individual Lego bricks, this is how we would define service capabilities. We would sort of say, okay, we've got inputs for that automation service. In this case, a load balancer, have some parsing variables like the FQDN, IP, servers we're going to add, the load balancer name. I've got some actions, things I want to do. This is the automation that you would define. Say, yep, these are the procedures. And then the outputs are the variables. Perhaps some of these automation areas will spit something out. Perhaps it's feedback. back to the user. Perhaps it's variables for another automation service to use. So ultimately, you want to define each of these Lego bricks, catalog them, inventory them, and store them appropriately in a code repository so people can quality check that. Now, if you tie all this together and think about a request for a traditional request for a virtual machine, you'll have an integrated approach for automated service delivery for IaaS here. And in this case, somebody would put in a request for a web server, and it would go off. We would generate a server name, often the hardest thing to automate because no one can agree on the server name. Then we generate an IP address, go to Active Directory, pre-stage the computer object, and then maybe clone the service. We've done our pre-stage pieces up to this point. Now we clone in infrastructure. Now we're into post-provisioning, configure monitoring. Maybe that's a tag that configures monitoring, or maybe we do call the service directly, update, say, ServiceNow, CMDB, and then hand over to configuration management. At this point, the service, the infrastructure is online on the network, and now we're installing software, maybe hardening the virtual machine a little bit further. And then perhaps we wrap up and close out a change control or request ticket, that we had as well. And so this is sort of that end-to-end traditional approach, very serial in nature, but allows you to stitch together those Lego bricks pretty easily. At this point, it's also worth looking at the infrastructure as code approach. This is the more modern approach using tools like Terraform and looks a little bit different. In this example, we're defining resources. We use this concept called resource providers. So you see resource Azure RM _ SQL _ server. That essentially is us saying we're going to use the resource provider provided by Terraform for Azure RM, which essentially is the ARM concept that Azure has. We've got monitor in there, we've got a service registry, we've got AD credentials, and there would be code underneath each of these sections, but to simplify, this is what we have on the screen here. And essentially then we would hand off to Terraform. Terraform says, okay, I'm going to read that code. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to create a server. This is a SQL Server request, but I'm also going to map out all those dependencies automatically. So I don't go through that serial approach and connect everything. Terraform does all that work for us, but we also have to ensure that we've defined that code correctly and it's ready for us to go forward with. Great thing then is all the configuration changes are saved to Terraform state for day 2 utilization, which we will talk about a little bit later on. But this concept very different from the prior one. This requires a different school of thought. If we want to make changes, we change them in code. We define everything in code. We don't necessarily go around clicking through portals to add and change things and add CPUs, memory, and stuff like that. We would change that in code or in variables. So a little bit different, concept for how we connect everything together there. With that, let's jump into the whole session. Obviously, is focused on how do we stitch all this together, and that's where Automation Hub really comes in. And just to set the stage, Automation Hub isn't necessarily a product that you buy. It is a concept and it's a framework. It's a collection of IP just from us working with multiple customers out there for stitching together multiple vendor tools and providing a portal to users. And the goal here is to simplify. What we've done is we said, look, we've looked at all the tools out there. We continue to evaluate these every year. We met with a lot of customers, early in 2020, and we do the same in 2021 to evaluate, is this still the right concept, right? Are we using the right tools correctly? Is there one tool that can rule them all? Answer is still no. We generally find much better using best of breed. But essentially what we do here is we decouple them so we can make changes to different areas of the automation stack to meet the needs of the different personas and the different requests coming in. IT's obviously, become increasingly more complex with all the services being offered in the public cloud, as well as the expansion of services on premises. And so we need a way to stitch this together easily. And so we break this out in these sections. Top left, we've got our portal for the users, the traditional users, if you will. They want to come through and request services from ServiceNow, or some of the modern users that are requesting more modern services that they need. Perhaps they're requesting access to pipelines, requesting complete environments on demand. So they would come in here, and this user would request via ServiceNow. That request would be tracked through a request ID throughout its whole process, so they'll get updates on their ticket as it sort of exits and enters back in here, and then we use Integration Hub through ServiceNow to pass that request off to the tech orchestrator, which stitches together all the different services we want. That could be something like Azure DevOps, another orchestrator, whatever it is, Jenkins, there's multiple options out there. Ultimately then going over to the stack engine to build our stack. And this could be, in a VM concept, like we said, could still be pre-deploy integrations, clone some VM or deploy some Kubernetes nodes, post-deploy integrations. And then if it's a virtual machine, you would typically then hand off to OS configuration management for application, deployment, agents, maybe hardening that machine at this point. And this would work, on premises or in the public cloud. Yeah, we would just consume the services here. Great thing here is Terraform has providers for all of these, so very, very easy to say, yep, I'm going to define infrastructure as code here, but also provide the request backup in an easy manner for somebody to consume, but then day two operations, they can use infrastructure as code. So there's some blended approaches we can take. All of this is really just based on, building that catalog first, just defining what services we want to offer, who are our users. On the bottom left, now we've also got the option for developers to come in via their CI/CD tooling, which perhaps, again, they requested via ServiceNow to begin with, but now they've got it up and running. They want to consume additional components or pieces of automation from our stack engine. They can use, say, Jenkins, Azure DevOps, other tools, GitOps, workflows, etc., and use all the automation we've created for them, use those tools, and then deploy their applications as part of their pipelines and release automation as well. So all of this comes together essentially to make it simpler, easier. We've decoupled these into these sections, as I mentioned, but we stitch this together in different ways for different customers. Just we have a way to accelerate it by doing it this way. With that said, let's jump into our first demonstration now, focused on Automation Hub. And the first thing you'll see when I jump into my web browser is this portal here. And this is the key part of Automation Hub. This is built on top of ServiceNow, what you're going to look at first of all, and that's the portal, and then all the automation is using some of those back-end tools that I discussed earlier. So let me head over to the web browser to begin this, and we'll just refresh to make sure we're logged in. There we go. So as you can see, here we're on the web page. You can see I'm at ahead LLC demo13.servicenow.com/ahead automation, which is where we've put the portal URL here. And on the bottom straight away, you can see we've got Sandbox, Standard Stacks, DevOps, and Consulting Services. After a lot of discussion with customers, we wanted to create categories that are easy for people to find their services, and these were the primary ones people came up with. Standard Stacks being the most common one, VM builds, Kubernetes infrastructure, maybe day two operations can sometimes go in there. Sandbox for people just wanting a playground, DevOps for those automation services, pipeline builds, all that, and then Consulting Services, how do they get help, as they need to over time from your IT team. If I go into the catalog on the left-hand side, similar viewpoint, here's all our items. We can filter, we can do AWS, we can do GCP, we can type Azure in here. We've got, VMware. We can filter all our different, service items that we ultimately have here. We've also got categories on the left-hand side, as I mentioned, similar to what we saw on the front screen there, essentially exactly the same way to navigate throughout. So if we go into Standard Stacks, first of all, you can see, in fact, I'm already there. You can see we've got different options here. One, we've got an Azure calculator as an option. This is one where you can build a Azure virtual machine and it'll calculate the pricing as you go along. We've got GCP instances, GKE instances. We've got AWS workspaces for AWS IaaS, with Terraform automation there as well. We've also got the single OS request for on-premises in here. So multiple services in our lab at any one time. Definitely happy to show you more of these and customize these as you need to. But to begin with, let me jump first of all into the Azure Calculator one here and just show you what a typical IaaS request might look like. So in this example, if I click Show Pricing Details here, you can see total machine cost, nothing there at this point, and this is going to update as we fill out this request. So essentially, I'm going to combine the business details with the technical details and then automate the provisioning of a virtual machine. So I can choose the requester here, Nick Collier. I can choose the application. At Ahead, we model everything after Ahead Aviation, our fictitious airline company. So we've got our bag management application here. And here I can now go through the technical details. I can guide the user through this VM request form. Environment, say production, what region, or maybe I only allow 2 regions, East US, West US, or multiple, depending on what I want to offer to the user. Operating systems could be a Windows OS, and then I can guide them through the instance types here. General, CPU optimized, burstable, etc. I'll just choose general here, and then that will present the D series in Azure to them. So I'll do like a D2 V3, and at this point it should start updating the VM pricing here, as well as additional managed service charges that you might want to put on top of that. We've got OS drive selection. Again, this will increase the price, and then perhaps you see backup says 0. If I go ahead and choose I want to back up the server, it's going to add those additional costs on for the backup storage and the service we want to run as well. And that essentially just, if I click submit here, that'll go off and build a virtual machine. So nothing too fancy, too crazy there. Essentially that ServiceNow request goes off, says thank you for submitting, and then they can check on the status of that at any point when they want to. But that's just a virtual machine build. What are some of the other things I would ultimately provide? Well, we talked about infrastructure as code, and the big one we spend a lot of time on is Terraform workspaces. And this allows us, whether it's in Google Cloud, whether it's in Azure, to basically create a Terraform workspace on demand. And essentially, instead of us just creating the virtual machine, we would create a GitHub code repository. We would use a Terraform template for a Linux VM on Azure. We would integrate with Terraform Workspace with the variables. So we're going to create the Terraform Workspace, add the variables for it to connect to Azure, and then create a Terraform Workspace that's linked to the GitHub repo as well. So all of this comes together to say, hey, I want to provision a VM, but I don't want to go through that serial process. I want to use a Terraform template, and I want to provide a Terraform Workspace for that user going forward. So I would go in here, I would choose again my name. I would say Nick Collier. I'll choose my business unit. I'll just say development here. And we'll do workspace names. So we'll call this, Summit WS for workspace 1. And then we'll do, repo. We'll do Summit repo 1 here as well. And we'll just to make sure we haven't already got one called up from previous demos, I'll call this 2021 and 2021 here. So we'll go ahead and click submit here. And then what I'll do is go ahead and log into Terraform now quickly. So if we go to terraform.io and jump into Terraform Cloud, sign in, and go ahead and we'll choose Automation Summit here. And let's see if we've got Summit fresh here. While we're waiting for that, I'm going to go ahead and check the GitHub repo. And you can see it there. So we've got Summit Repo 2021 that we just created. You can see if I go into mylinuxvm.tf, this is the code repo using those providers I talked about earlier on for Azure basically. And it's got everything from public IP configuration, NIC configuration, VM name, everything essentially in here as well. So the GitHub repo is there. Let's just refresh here and make sure the Terraform workspace comes up as well. There it is. So we've got Summit WS1-2021. And you can see if I go into this workspace, nothing to see right there, but if I go to variables, I'll see it's actually connected that workspace to my Azure tenant, and it's put the sensitive keys in there. So we don't want users to really be worrying about this. So I've created the workspace, and I've essentially linked it to Azure with variables so that I can authenticate. And if I go to settings and go to version control, I can see that it's linked to that GitHub repo. And when it built that repo, the reason it's got that code in there is that it cloned it from a repo that can be used for provisioning, that we've said, yep, this is authorized, this is where I want to take it from. You can also use the registry, the private module registry. There's other ways to sort of get modules and organize them too. Those are all options there that you'll explore as you go through Terraform. But in this example, very simple. I've said, yep, connect to this repo. I created cloned that repo from a repo that allows cloning from it, and that's essentially how that code, got in here. If I go back to this point, Summit WS1 hasn't provisioned anything yet. So now I can go ahead and queue the plan. I can say queue up the plan in Terraform for it to run. And now it's going to do a plan. It's going to check, can it authenticate against Azure? Is there anything already run in there? And then, if it passes, it will go ahead and build that Linux virtual machine. If it fails, it'll tell us here, and then we would go in, correct the code, do a commit, and then try again. But we'll give it a few seconds here. It won't take very long. See if this code's still good. Yep, it's all good there. And you can see if I scroll up, it's going to tell me all the things Terraform is going to provision. And once it's completed its plan, I'll be able to execute a run here as well. Now you can also add in governance policies, sentinel policies. If you want to restrict things and check things, those are all options you can add in here as well. But you can see there, it's essentially passed. So I would do confirm and apply, and it will go ahead and start building that in Azure. So we can come back to that a little bit later on just to show you. It's essentially just going to build a virtual machine in Azure, and the apply is running now. And again, if I want to change anything, if I want to add any more infrastructure, I can go ahead and update the code here, add additional resource providers, update that, check that in, and then that will go ahead, commit, and then trigger the Terraform run to occur as well. And so you can see that's going ahead and build in there. Again, nothing too fancy. If I go back to ServiceNow at this point, I'll just show you one more area under the catalog. Is we've also got things like environments on demand under DevOps services. So we could say, app dev platforms, say Java on AKS. This is one where we essentially said, look, we're not going to ask many questions. We're just going to build an entire environment. You choose your cluster size, and it will go out and build a complete Azure DevOps project for you, build the AKS clusters, cluster nodes, and then give you a whole entire pipeline, everything ready to use. So that's app dev, Java, and AKS. We've also got full environments on demand here with a whole bunch of additional questions and options for you as well. So really the point here is I'm trying to show you there's different ways to offer this up. We can have different runtime stacks. We can have different region options. We can offer AKS namespaces. We can do GKE. We can do AWS. It doesn't really matter what our target cloud provider is. By us leveraging this framework of ServiceNow as a request engine over to our tech orchestrator and then using tools like Terraform, we stitch all those together and then can provision directly to the user the stack that they want. So with that, I'm going to jump back to slides here at this point and continue our journey down the automation here. So if we now look at automation expansion as the next logical piece here. Okay, I've got provisioning completed, but how do I think about some of these other areas? We've got provisioning categories, we've got VMs, applications, perhaps I've got bare metal, desktops. I know Dustin talked about this in one of the earlier sessions around all the areas of automation. There's lots and lots of things we can do, but we don't often talk enough about operations and maintenance. So there could be security operations, resource allocations, availability, probably using HA and things already in your environment without realizing it, capacity, scaling, right-sizing, configuration management, day two operations, which I want to spend a bit of time on, and then what do we want to do around automating change control. And if you start to bucket things in these areas, you'll find there are lots and lots of services and things that you probably find you do every day, your operations teams do every day that can just be automated away so they can work on that higher value work that they're capable of. So when we look at day two, look at a control plane and policy architecture around this. And I've got some examples here. When we look at the whole set of infrastructure from Automation Hub, we've got our platform. We're dealing with data center, colo, cloud, edge, SaaS, as we talked about. We've got those compute storage network layers. We've got containers, VMs, serverless, bare metal OS, data applications on top there, and enterprise services, like ServiceNow and others on the left-hand side. So then when we start to look at our automation stack, now it helps to think about, okay, I've got my automation and orchestration, perhaps Terraform's a big component there. I want to start to add in a control plane. This could be something like Azure Arc, which we can talk about. I want to add in some security. Perhaps I use HashiCorp Vault for secrets key management. And then I want general management, or say Kubernetes clusters across, all my environments. And again, Azure Arc could be a way to bring in, Google clusters under management in Azure there as well. So lots of options, in terms of control plane and policy now. But if you look at this framework, these are some key ones that we're starting to see evolve. If we look at Terraform from day two operations, if you recall, we built that SQL server and it mapped the dependencies automatically. But what happens when you want to make a change? Well, you would go in, like I said in the demo, you would make a change in code. Terraform is going to then realize that and essentially be triggered from the update to the code repository. That current state is going to be referenced. It's going to check against and say, the monitoring piece changed, so I don't need to mess around with anything else. I'm just going to go ahead and update monitoring. And so this is a big shift in one of the day two operation behaviors that you undertake, because you're not saying having somebody go click in a portal and request a new monitor rule, send a ticket off, or even do some scripting automation. Here you say, no, go ahead, change it in code, commit, and then your change will take effect. Another good example in the DevSecOps space is key and secrets management. This is where you can introduce Vault into your automation framework, and you can essentially say, the admin now is responsible for mounting the database secret backend, configuring the backend, creating roles, and then the application can request credentials, and then Vault will return a new set of credentials, based on the TLL that you've got there. And so this is another example of how we want to integrate security into the whole process and simplify the way application teams request, or applications request, sets of credentials for authentication. So it also can be integrated into the whole process as you build out. IaaS patching comes up a lot for us as well. And so day two operations with IaaS patching, essentially one of the services we've updated is with Automation Hub is integrating Azure Update Management, taking a typical patch phase collection. If you will, a lot of customers will have phase 1, 2, 3, 4, groups 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, depending on their patch windows. So if we said, hey, we want these VMs in phase 1, these VMs in phase 2, maybe phase 1 is dev, 2 is stage, 3 is prod, and maybe 4 is customer-facing revenue-generating services, and we want them to be patched in that order. Well, essentially, we can create an automation framework to allow users self-service to choose which phase they want their server to go into. They can choose then how to take their servers out of patch and rotation as well. And so we created a couple of workflows, and the process around thinking about this is, okay, if I want to offer the ability to pause patching, what needs to be done? And this is part of that mapping process we talked about. App dev needs to postpone updates. Perhaps something is going on with that machine. Perhaps they can't take an update right now. They know that patch is going to break something. So patch Tuesdays come out. There's a .NET framework patch, and perhaps it's going to break something. So the app dev updates the CI in ServiceNow as delay OS patching. That's what we want to happen, but we're going to automate that for them. ServiceNow calls an Azure function, passes in some variables, and the Azure function then sets the following tags: update group equals delayed, delay patching until $date. And we can automatically set that date for them. Perhaps we'll put it back into rotation on the next cycle, and then the process is complete. Then when we want to resume patching, we essentially say, okay, well, we don't want to just leave that server out there indefinitely. So now we're going to create a day 2 operation for running a nightly job, or perhaps the app dev team wants to re-enable OS patching on their terms, essentially earlier than when we check it up. And so we have a nightly job that basically Azure function reviews all VMs and checks the delayed patching on tag. The nightly job can, if it's initiated, it looks at the tag, says is the tag value older than 30 days? If the answer is yes, it's like, nope, you've got to go back into rotation. So the Azure function then sets those tags. It says delayed patching on, not applicable, and copies value from the default update group tag. So it knows, hey, you should be in phase 1, 2, 3, or 4, and puts it into the update group. Or if it's not initiated by the nightly job, then it'll use the variable provided by the user. And then move on to the next VM. So couple of ways to essentially do. We're trying to provide self-service to the user so they can either put their server into the rotation and where they want it, and we don't want to allow them to skip more than 30 days because they will be against security policy. Maybe they get to delay one time for 30 days because of an issue, and then it has to be back in. And so that's essentially this workflow essentially is what we constructed around that. So let me jump back into the portal here and show you what that essentially looks like. So if we jump in here back to the home screen and I go to the catalog, and you'll see we've got a head update management here. And so I've got update group 1, 2, 3, and 4. And essentially what this is doing, this is in ServiceNow, but it's pulling data from Azure. It's saying, okay, I've got these 2 machines in update group 1, DevVM05, a CentOS 6 machine, and another one here. If I go back, I can look at another update group 4. I've got some other machines there. Let me jump into Azure as well so we can sort of see those machines. And here we are in Azure, and if I go into our resource groups, in fact, we've got all of this in our demo group here, which is Update Management, RG. And if I scroll through here, you can see we've got a bunch of those virtual machines. So let's say we look at DevVM05 as an example, and you'll see here it's got Disable Updates False, Environment Dev, Head Lab. This is some of our own tagging internally. But the key thing is you've got Update Group 1, and next patching date, which is May 2nd here. And so what I can do, if I go and find this machine, which essentially should be an Update Group 1 and a DevVM05 CentOS 6, if I go back here and we go back to Update Group 1, and I go here, click the VM, there it is, go into that one. And now we're looking at the CI for the virtual machine. We've created a view over here. And you can see that OS patching is not delayed right now, and currently it's in Update Group 1. Now I can move it immediately to say Update Group 2, so I can click here and click Save. And if we wait there a second, now we'll go over to DevVM05. If I refresh this machine, give it a little bit, it'll probably take a few seconds for it just to kick off from ServiceNow. And then we can see, refreshed a few times, Update Group 2 is now selected. But it's not in the delayed patching right now. So now I can go back to ServiceNow and I can say, yep, I want to delay OS patch it now. Hit save. And again, you can see now that's checked. So still in Update Group 2. but we've essentially elected to delay patching here. So if I go back to the machine itself here, we should see in a second, disable updates, should see, yep, update group delayed. So there we go. So we know that we've currently delayed patch in there, for the time being. So even though it's got the patch window there, it's going to delay that in the next 30 days. The nightly job will check in, and then it will know, yep, the default date, window it's supposed to be in is the update group 2, and then it will go ahead and change that back. So essentially we've built that process around making sure somebody can go in here, they can still go in and change, update group 1 immediately here. If we go back over to CentOS 6, the DevVM05, you can see here if I refresh again, yep, there we go. So update group now says update group 1. So it's back into rotation and is no longer delayed at this point. So with that, that's another demo there. And obviously, lots and lots of options that we can show you. The goal is obviously the framework allows us to create any of these things very, very easily, and we can tune demos to your liking. If there's certain things you want to see to meet the needs of your business, that's where our automation factory team comes in and really helps customers with that. So with that, thank you very much. Appreciate the time today. I hope you've enjoyed the Automation Summit and happy to take any questions.
Everyone, hope you enjoyed the session there, and I'm not sure I had a little glitch there as we moved into live Q&A here, but I hope you enjoyed the summit, and yeah, looking forward to taking any questions you might have on on what we covered so far. This is a lot we tried to cover there in a very short space of time, so please definitely use the Q&A box, and I'm happy to take some time here for the next 5 or so minutes we've got to answer anything you've got. So fire away, and I'll pull up the Q&A panel while people are punching in questions there. So we've got the first one here from Alexander. So in infrastructure as code, how do you handle custom situations where some of the initial tasks may have been completed outside of automation for some unknown, parentheses, evil reason potentially there? Yeah, so a couple of key things there. One, and I think you're saying like people could be doing automation without going through the automation framework, and some of that obviously you can't stop. You can't stop somebody running a script if they've got rights to do things. But what we can do is when we're executing automation, we typically try to tag or notify, particularly in things like change control and other request engines. We notify where did that request come from. We've actually got another demo on that. It's probably from a year ago or so now. We covered that exact topic, and it was a case of, okay, what initiated this request? What initiated the task against the API? And you can start to log that, and then you can start to look for the anomalies of where are requests coming from that perhaps didn't go through the automation framework as a whole. The other thing in particular, when it comes to infrastructure as code, anything like in the Terraform example, you could think of your commit as kind of your new change control in one way as well. So that could be another way to sort of look at things, as it's coming through. Your process around infrastructure as code is a little bit different to those procedural-based orchestration workflows. So, but yeah, great question, because it's, as you expand automation, you run the risk of creating more and more technical debt over time, as well. So, okay, so I think we got that one answered. So what else we got? Yeah. So can you expand on different approaches when it comes to declarative versus procedural? Yeah. So this is a good question, because I think for the longest, probably about the last couple of years, everybody's sort of gone down this notion of, is it hey, I have to be all in on infrastructure as code, or, if I'm doing it the old traditional way, to use the word traditional, is that wrong? And the answer is no. I mean, there's no right or wrong there. It's really matching up to the use case. So we do a ton of work today with Terraform. Our teams are booked solid just doing Terraform work with customers. And that's because you can define complete stacks and create them and present them in a very compelling way, especially when you start to get in the module registry and build the workflows around that. And then sometimes we need to layer in typical orchestration around that, where we want to touch other systems. And sometimes we don't, application team isn't really looking to do immutable infrastructure and just wants a single VM, and sometimes they go different directions. So there's all sorts of different scenarios there. The goal is to keep the framework simple. I always come back to that. And make it easy to essentially figure out what the application team's trying to achieve, and then just assemble it in the simplest way using as many Lego bricks as you sort of already created there. So I've got another one here. I don't know if it's just not showing everything on my system. Typically, priority 1 incidents and act manual infrastructure just to get everything back on. Okay, I think it was a comment in relation to the previous example there. And you see there's a question hidden in there. It'll take me P1 instance and act manual infrastructure. So we haven't talked about reactive automation much today in this session, but that's another piece that we go into pretty heavily with customers as well. I mean, a lot of people sort of trying to get this first framework provisioning, deprovisioning out the way. I mentioned the other areas of automation, and we've done some sessions on reactive automation as well, where incident comes in, and if you've got a playbook of things you know how to do, good examples on the IaaS space. We're just like expanding disks. We had examples where an incident would come in if a server was about to run out of disk space, and that could bring something down, and often it was a bunch of logs filling up something, so it wasn't optimal. And then rather than, wake somebody up, or maybe we still wake somebody up, but we can maybe take some corrective action immediately as well. So there's I think what's interesting there, and that came from Phil, is, I'd love to hear about the incidents you're referring to, and then, let's explore those and see how we can actually, address those as well. So, but yeah, great point. I think we've got time for probably one or two more, yeah. How have customers transformed their teams to cope with automation? Yeah, so this comes up a lot when we're doing briefings, early on as customers are going down the automation journey. I think there's a couple of key things here. One, I think you just have to have an honest conversation of, do you have the team? Do they want to automate? Who's got the skills? Maybe it's people that come from a scripting background. Maybe it's VMware people that have been doing PowerShell and things like that. Maybe it's people that have worked against the vSphere APIs and everything there. So there's multiple areas you can get the skill from. Maybe it's a Linux team, maybe it's an app dev people that want to kind of embrace more on the DevOps side and help people learn these skills. So no right or wrong again here. I think there's some patterns that we typically see. Is one, there has to be sort of a governing body, and that could be a virtual team that goes across areas that's sort of responsible for the orchestration. Because what we don't want to do is have lots and lots of teams all writing in very, very different ways. And there has to be some sort of style guideline and overall governance around automation as a whole. Who can execute? What can execute? Does it have to write a change order for touching something? And those things aren't there to get in the way, like ITIL process. It's really how do we change the process to meet the overall objectives and make it simpler for everyone to operate. And then, some people will embrace it, some people won't. But I think you find those champions and that really want to get involved, and some people really, really enjoy it and kind of go from there. So that one there. I think that's all we've got time for here. I know we've got another few plugs here to end off, and feel free to reach out to me directly if you've got other questions. But a couple of things. One, if you please be so kind as to go check out our sponsor booth. Huge thank you to our sponsors who have sponsored our automation summit. We couldn't do this without them, so thank you very, very much. Please fill out the survey. There's a chance to win AirPod Max headphones, so we'd love for you to give us the feedback. We rely on it heavily so we can tune these and make sure the content's relevant and we're hitting the right things. And, we've hit the mark for you, so please do that. And obviously you've got that chance to win a prize that we always like to throw out there. And then there's a bonus session coming up at 3:30 Eastern, 2:30 Central. That is a Derby Day session. Place your bets with Jody Demling. It's the Kentucky Derby this weekend. So we've got this bonus session, and at the completion of the session that you're watching now, you'll be taken to the registration page, or it's on the main page. But essentially, this is a Q&A with a betting expert, so hopefully they can help you win some money if that's your thing. So enjoy that. But with that, it's been a fantastic few days here. So from my point of view, thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to watch the summits and all the sessions the team's put on for you. And please just reach out if we can be of further help. So thank you so much.